Welcome to the RON Annual Convening 2020 launch event. We're so excited to be here with you today. I'm Andrea Sanaviratna, Director at FSG and co-facilitator of the Retail Opportunity Network. You'll hear from my co-facilitator, Faye Hanley-Brown, who many of you met in person in a few minutes. The RON team at FSG has been hard at work over the last few months to make sure that this virtual experience provides you with an opportunity to learn and to connect with each other. This year, we're gathering to focus on racial equity so that we can achieve greater economic mobility for all frontline workers. This topic is a direct result of the feedback that you provided to us in July. We heard loud and clear that you wanted to dive deeper and build your capacity to do the hard work needed to center racial equity in your programs and in your organizations. We know many of you have started this work already within your organizations, and some of you have dedicated your careers and lives to this. Some of you have just started and are getting your feet wet through events like this. We're so glad to have you here, no matter where you are in your journey. We think that there's power in collectively learning from each other, no matter where we are, and in taking action together. Since this is not a one-off topic that we can become proficient in with just one session, we wanted to embark on a learning journey. And again, that word journey, you'll hear that over and over again, with you over a period of 6 months. And luckily, we have a virtual platform that we'll be able to leverage this year. We have 2 learning objectives for all of us over the next 6 months. So the first is that we want to come to a shared understanding of racial equity in the workforce system, specifically where we are today and how we got here. The launch event will focus on where we are today, and the January 12th session will focus on how we got here. Both will be really important for us to build a solid foundation. I will share more about that January session that will be facilitated by the Racial Equity Institute when we gather tomorrow. Second, we want to be able to identify what action each of us can take as individuals, as organizations, in the field to shift the system to create more equitable outcomes for all frontline workers. You'll be able to get a little bit of that in each of the months, but in particular, you'll be able to get that in February, March, April, and May. I will share more about that February session that will also be facilitated by the Racial Equity Institute on day 3. So you may be thinking, well, Andrea, I just really want to get to that action, but I've talked about this enough. Well, fair enough. And at the same time, we know that the diagnosis impacts the treatment. If we're not collectively understanding what is keeping the system in place, the interventions we're working on won't be as effective in shifting the system in the long term. In addition, there's just so much collective wisdom that we have in the work that we're doing. I'm sure some people have tried things that have worked really well and others have tried things that have not worked so well. I think the collective sharing of those lessons is just so important. And the magic of the RON is that we have organizations working on all parts of the system to create economic mobility for all frontline workers. These different types of organizations like think tanks, direct service organizations, higher ed institutions, place-based organizations are all in one way or another influencing employers, funders, policymakers. If we're able to do that all while aligning on the messages and the data points we're bringing to those stakeholders, we'll be able to do that much more effectively and bring our vision of creating a more equitable system to life. And we know that we'll also be more effective if we're putting in that work to transform at the individual and organizational levels as well. Okay, so that was a lot. So let me get into the December launch event a little bit more. So the next 3 days and beyond. So first, the launch event starts today. Hooray, you're here, welcome. And it takes place through December 10th. Each day we will meet from 12 p.m. Eastern to 2 p.m. Eastern. We have time zones all across, so I will leave it to you to do the math. And you can check out the event site for more information about each day. We'll generally start each day with a speaker and end the day in table discussions. And again, I think both the learning and the connecting with each other is really important. So I encourage you to attend the whole session. You have a detailed agenda for each day on page 3 of the workbook, which you might have gotten in the mail if you registered on time. You can download in the resources section of the website if you didn't. Over the next 6 months, again, going back to the learning and connecting, we really want you to be able to connect with RON members, and we really designed the event space for you to do that. So go ahead and use it. Click around, see what's on the event side. If you go to conversations, under that, you'll see public forums. If you want to connect with each other and ask questions of the entire RON member group, or inbox and send private messages to folks that you just want to connect with and haven't gotten a chance to do that. And again, that resources page is full of a lot of goodies, both the workbook, the attendee guide, and then also amazing videos by some RON members doing wonderful work in racial equity. All right, so that you can do over the course of the next 6 months. For today, here's what you should know. And I know we've been living on Zoom for so many months right now. So, but just a few reminders. If you have any tech issues, contact Yuli Rivera. You'll be able to find him under the participants list, and he has a bright white background, virtual background behind him. Just chat him and he'll take care of you. Please mute yourself when you're not talking. Keep your video turned on so we can see each other and continue to engage. Know that we're recording. And then use the chat function liberally, as you are. I think I've seen many, many chats since I started talking to engage with each other. And then raise your hand. We'll have a Q&A section today and tomorrow. So we'll be able to pass the mic to you and bring you onto the screen with the speakers. And the way you do that, I have to remind myself every time, even though I'm on Zoom all the time, is go to that participants part of the Zoom meeting, and a little white box will pop up you and click the raise hand. And then in addition, while maybe if you want to do this right now, go to participants and find yourself, it says me, go to more and rename yourself to name, comment, organization, whatever your organization is. So we can, again, find each other and engage with each other. Okay, I know you, again, you have the agenda, the full agenda in the workbook today on page 3, but I will pass it to Faye to introduce our speaker today, Michael McAfee.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Andrea. And it's I'm Faye Hanley-Brown. I'm a managing director at FSG and a longtime member of the RON. So I have to say, it's just wonderful to see so many familiar faces and new faces. This is an incredible community, and we're excited to welcome you to today's event. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today's conversation, Dr. Michael McAfee, who is the president and CEO of PolicyLink. Michael's going to kick us off today and frame the conversation about the focus on racial equity that we're seeing right now, and whether that is a movement or a moment, and importantly, what that means for all of us and for all of our work. I've known Michael for several years now, so I can tell you how incredibly fortunate we are to have him with us today. He is truly a leader in racial and economic equity. And I think what's really exciting is that he brings a perspective that spans the entire system that we are all working on. So he has done a lot of work in corporate racial equity, including PolicyLink's partnership with FSG and Just Capital around the CEO blueprint for racial equity. He brings a public sector perspective. He led for many years the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink and also held roles at HUD. And he also brings the social sector perspective, obviously in his leadership role at PolicyLink, but also in roles that he's had in philanthropy and in the social sector. So we're incredibly lucky to have him today. And he's just a tireless leader, a champion for everyone in America, particularly those that are experiencing structural barriers to really experience economic prosperity. So we're incredibly lucky to have him. And I just have to say personally, I find you to be one of the most inspiring speakers I know. So Michael, we're so excited to welcome you.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be in your space. And as I enter your space, I ask for a little grace because I may say things that are triggering, don't sit right with you at first, but I ask you just to think about them. Because many of you are already on a racial equity journey. I'm on my own racial equity journey. And so I'm talking to you about observations that I see in the world. I'm really not trying to tell you what to do, because the gift of being on a journey is you'll discover that for yourself. And so I just wanted to set things up that way. So if my tone sounds absolute, I want you to know that it is not. I'm still learning, etc. But I wanted to start with this notion of, is this a movement or is this a moment? It depends on who you are. It depends on who you are. Some of us in this country have the luxury to not have to worry about it. Others of us were born into this world having to worry about it every single day. And in fact, the design of the nation was such that it makes us have to worry about it. And I really want us to think about that, because in this moment of awakening, something powerful is happening. We're reckoning with some hard truths that this nation hasn't wanted to own. First, this nation was founded on stolen land, genocide, and slave labor. And we've never fully resolved that reality. We've made progress, no doubt. But even in our progress, I want you to think about something. I want you to hold a number, and I want it to become your magnificent obsession. If this is the greatest nation in the world, why are there 100 million plus folks, 1 in 3 people, who are economically insecure? The majority of the folks in poverty in America work 2 jobs. They're not deadbeats. They work 2 jobs and still can't afford to live in this country. I want you to think about that being a design challenge of our democracy and our economy. That's just not a fluke. That's just not like, oh, these people are lazy and trifling, and if they just would just do what they need to do, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, they'd be better off. Absolutely, personal responsibility is essential. Personal responsibility is essential, just as having a design of a nation where everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential is. And that is the definition of equity. So whether this is a movement or moment depends on where you sit. For me, this is my life's work. This movement started long before I was even conceived. My ancestors have called me to this moment. And now my job is not to just worry about this moment in this movement for Black folks. It is to deal with something that I see on the horizon that we often don't talk about. Realizing the all in the definition of equity. Because here's what I know when I look at the data. A world that was designed to deny me opportunity, whether we're talking about redlining, whether we're talking about how the GI Bill launched and didn't allow my family to access it, it has now become too toxic for white America. If you read a book like Dying of Whiteness, you'll see how racialized public policy in this nation right now has, in many cases, mortality rates of white men increasing at a clip faster than those of Black men. Think about that for a moment. The toxic inequality in this nation isn't just harming people of color anymore. It is hurting large swaths of white folks. And the reality is, this is the work for our generation, because it is this Black-white paradigm in this nation that still is our wicked problem, and it gets in the way. Now, what I'm excited about is we're starting to deal with it. And while we can talk about a host of intersections, and we should talk about those, today, let's talk about race. We've not really reconciled race. And so we've designed a world that has us dealing with all sorts of problems that are race-based. And we're not just talking about in the past. I can't tell you in this moment how many conversations I've been in COVID where health practitioners were pleading not to disaggregate the data around COVID deaths and who was being impacted. Now think about this. They know that disaggregating the data is a smart thing to do. so that you can craft the best strategy. But the reason why they didn't want that done was because they knew that when people started seeing, they had an intuition that if people started seeing that it was really Black and brown folks who were being hurt first and worst, that folks wouldn't want to continue to invest. Think about just holding that concern and having to override best practice so that results can be achieved. Think about the Florida unemployment insurance system. Look at the reports intentionally designed to not work because of that racist trope of the Black welfare queen. It's not true, but nevertheless, it's used. Never imagining that we'd be in a pandemic and middle-class folks, white folks, Asians, Blacks, etc., would need an unemployment system. We've designed it to intentionally not work, make it difficult for those people to get the supports that they need. So when you say, why is racial equity important? It's important because we keep designing public policies to deal with it. You just heard it in the past election. Black folks were going to destroy our suburbs. Think about that. The very folks who would deny race are the ones who keep using it. The very folks who would deny race and act like we have moved on continue to use it in such subtle and sometimes overt ways. And what I'm happy about in being in this moment with you is that you are doing the work to overcome some of these racial barriers. And so what I'm asking you to hold right now, because I want to turn to my colleagues who have some tremendous insights on this, is this is a design challenge for our nation. This isn't a fluke, and you will not charity your way out of this. Think about this for a moment. We think so little of our people in this country because of how we see folks who have less resources. We can't even give them $300 a month to survive. I want you to really think about this because this is how deep that Black-white paradigm has infected our policy conversations. All around the world, if you just look, people have shown us, you know what? We could subsidize wages and keep people in their jobs and keep them in their home. But in this nation, we have this mindset that you can just be a rugged individual and deal with it. We got more than 40 million folks facing imminent eviction because they lost their jobs, no fault of their own. Instead of keeping them housed, we'd rather have them be evicted and then ask the nonprofit sector to clean it up. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you, the nonprofit sector can't clean up the mess of this design challenge. And that's why corporate America is so important right now. Corporate America is on the leading edge of the racial equity movement, and they just don't know it fully yet. And they're on the leading edge of the equity movement because they have a unique skill that is needed now more than ever. Corporations know how to bend the legal and regulatory framework of this nation to their will. And what that 100 million plus needs is for us to begin to design a world that works for them and allows us to have a healthy, thriving business environment. We can do both of those things. But I'll tell you this, if we do not deal with the all in the equity definition in this moment, that 100 million number is going to continue to go up. It's not going down. And civil society can't do it by itself, and government has been weakened to where it can barely do its health and safety function. That's why corporate America is in this unique space. So what I want you to think about is this. We can do something about these challenges that you've heard me describe. I'm seeing corporations come into this work in beautiful ways. I'm seeing Ben & Jerry's and a coalition of CEOs tackle a structural issue of qualified immunity. I'm seeing banks create career pathways for people of color. I'm seeing people beginning to create living wages by region instead of just living on that minimum wage standard. I'm seeing people remake their corporations over the course of years. I'm watching leaders to develop the consciousness to see the humanity of their employees and do simple things like give them consistent schedules so that they can plan, to help them with childcare, to help them pay for college. I'm watching folks advocate for the world that we want, and that makes me really hopeful. So what I want you to think about is, this is a movement that started from the founding of this nation. This nation is an experiment. Our democracy is an experiment. And we all are invited to participate in that experiment, no matter whether you want to do it for good or bad. I'm not going to begrudge either one of those things. What I'm asking you to do is to participate. And if you choose to participate in such a way that we can realize the promise of equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. If we do that work, this nation will be strong and healthy. We'll have stable markets. If we choose to avoid this work, it's going to continue to be waiting for us, whether we do it today or 20 years from now. There is no escaping the black or white paradigm and the toxicity that it has created in this nation. And I want you to think, if anything else, about your future generations of your children and grandchildren. This is no longer just a Black problem. It is hurting everyone, from how we treat children at the borders, to how we over-police in poor communities, to how we choose not to pay workers a living wage, quite frankly. For me, I'm not trying to have an ideological conversation with you. I'm trying to have a conversation around what is the work that's needed to have a strong nation. And I would ask you to kind of raise your gaze a little bit and think about, how do I get out of my own box of my own worldview and my ideology and see the humanity of other people and simply ask the question, what does it take to create a thriving America for everyone? Because that's the work for us. This is a results-based moment in a movement that started from the founding. And we all are invited to participate in it. And I choose to participate in it, absolutely trying to improve this Black-white paradigm, design a world that works for all. But I'm also trying to deal with my own issues of race, my own issues of being a man in a country where we've not seen the humanity of women. So while this moment make us all feel uncomfortable, I ask you to sit with that discomfort. And I ask you to think about why you're uncomfortable and what do you have to do to be a better man, a better woman, a better person. That's the invitation. This is how our country will be great. This is how we will save and strengthen our democracy, by realizing the promise of equity. Think about this as a design challenge. Don't think of it as a solution you can solve with a program. Absolutely, those are important in your firm. But we must design a nation, its laws and its regulations that support our hopes and aspirations. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. What I would like to do now is I would like to introduce you to two of my colleagues. Clair Minson is the founder and principal consultant at Sandra Grace, LLC, a counseling and consulting firm committed to providing consulting and thought partnership to nonprofit, for-profit, and public organizations seeking to embed racial equity practices in their organization, their operations, and programmatic activities. And Dr. Derek Avery is the C.T. Bauer Chair of Inclusive Leadership in the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. Dr. Avery received his PhD in Industrial and Organizational Psychology from Rice University in 2001, and his primary research interests are in workforce diversity, sex, age, experience, religion, and culture, and employee input mechanisms. He is perhaps best known for his work on diversity climates, which has established them as instrumental in reducing demographic differences in employment and engagement and absenteeism, and identifying key drivers of unit-level customer satisfaction and sales growth. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Claire, let's start with you with your remarks, then we'll go to you, Dr. Avery.
Sure. Welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time we're all in. The beauty of technology is that we can all sit in our spaces and share this space together virtually. I am always excited and humbled to share any screen with both of my colleagues here, Dr. Michael and Dr. Derek. So I'm excited to be here today. And I'm glad that you started with carrying both the personal, right, and the professional, because this work is personal. We cannot separate our personal experiences and interactions with people and systems from the work that we are trying to do, right? And so I, in many ways can say that I have built a career on, in the first 6 years, really perpetuating economic oppression, right? Perpetuating practices in workforce development that perpetuated harmful narratives about the people that we were serving and what skills they had versus what skills they didn't. And it wasn't until I had a moment where I had to think about the systems change effort while designing and working with employers within the maritime industry, that I had to say, wait, my work is really trying to connect Black and brown people to a white dominant male industry. What does that mean then about how I connect and engage with the people that I'm serving? And what does it mean about how and my responsibility with the employers that I'm working with? And how should that shift the conversation? But I will be honest with you and say that it wasn't until Freddie Gray was murdered, because I was in Baltimore at the time, that I had to make a decision. That I would either continue to have the water cooler conversations, about the racism that we experience and we see in workforce development, or I would actually do the work, right? I didn't know what the work was. I didn't know what the terminology and the language was, but I knew what I felt. And we know when we feel that something just doesn't feel right about the way I'm describing this individual, the way I'm talking about this story, right? Or the way it feels like I'm using their story to get monetary gain from my organization, right? When their generational dynamics have not changed. And so I had to reckon with myself before I could reckon with the industry that I was building a career in. And so fast forward to George Floyd. Here we are at another moment in time, 5 years later, where I had to make another decision. I'm either going to continue to speak truth to power, or I'm going to continue to sit on the sidelines, right? Like there are these moments in time when we're in another moment where we have a choice. How long will I continue? Like how long am I in this work for, right? Like racism is not going away today. This is the generational work. And so I implore all of you to think about, like, we are talking about transformative systems change and fundamentally changing the design, to use Michael's word, the design of this country, right? It was designed not to support people that look like me and to support my colleagues of color. But we have an opportunity in this moment to fundamentally change that. But people drive systems. And so if people are not doing the work of understanding racism, capitalism, genocide, colonialism, imperialism, right? And like how that manifests in our industries and in our day-to-day lives and in our interactions with each other and with the systems that we're engaging, then we are limited in our ability to truly transform systems and change systems. And so it really is about what is your individual work and the commitment to yourself to understand, and then how does that translate into how you change the systems, the organizations, the cultures, the language that you're using in many ways that can lead us towards equity or keep us where we are. So thank you for having me here today.
Thank you. Dr. Avery.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here. As Claire just said, I have two really quick observations that I want to point out before I dive into a couple of prepared things. The first of those observations is that no one should ever have to speak after Michael and Claire. That is just completely and totally unfair. The second of those two observations is giving an academic 3 to 5 minutes to present anything is kind of like giving an alcoholic a shot, right? Like that just typically doesn't go well. But with those as the parameters, I'm going to do my best. So I just kind of want to frame this up a little bit because I think the real meat and potatoes of this conversation is going to be the Q&A, where we really get to hear from you guys in terms of what it is that you're interested in. And I'm absolutely loving watching the chat pop up during the course of this virtual event. But I want to just kind of give 5 quick nuggets as to things that I've seen happening within organizations, because like a lot of academics, it's really easy to get immersed in what's happening in the ivory tower. And this year has really pulled me out of the ivory tower in a way that I hadn't in the past, right? It really made me disengage from the system of, doing this scientific research designed to try and shed light on how it is that these systems of inequality continue to be perpetuated, to really saying, wait a minute, let me stop speaking to this small group of people and see if I can speak to this larger group of people. And one of the things that happened as a result of that is that organizations really started reaching out to me because they weren't quite sure where to go, right? So the first thing that really became evident is we don't know what to do. And in large part, we as organizations don't know what to do because the past default was never designed for us to fix this issue, right? So as Michael points out, this flaw is built into the system, right? And the past default approach from an organizational standpoint was really thou shalt not discriminate, right? So don't, and it wasn't even really so much that as much as thou shalt not get caught discriminating, right? So if the past default was always avoiding being caught engaging in blatant discrimination, well, we don't have the tools for us to really start to tackle this notion of, what is institutional racism? How do we, illuminate it so that everybody can see it clearly for what it is and then start to dismantle it? The second thing is that the dominant heuristic of this response has really been something is better than nothing, right? And that's really taken two forms. The first is that people have really embraced this notion that it's better to say something than to remain silent. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not, right? Because some of the statements that I've seen, it just begs for, okay, that's a really strong statement. Now, what are you going to do? And if you don't know the answer to the what are you going to do, then it is a real mistaken judgment to jump out there with the big, strong statement. The second illustration of that heuristic going wrong is that people believe that it's better to do something than to remain dormant. And doing something is not always the best thing, right? If you've ever been out of shape, you know that just, going to the gym and working out as hard as you can for as long as you can, that's probably not it, right? There is a process that led you to this point, and there needs to be a process to lead you from this point. Action for the sake of action is not it. We need to be better than that. The third thing, we're missing the depth of the issue. So I've had, a number of organizations reach out and say, hey, can you come in and give a talk, so that we can, get rid of this whole racism situation. And I'm like, wow. So systemic racism has been slow cooking in this country for centuries. And you think that someone is, I'm not that guy. And I don't know who that guy or that woman is who's going to come in and take this dish that's been slow cooking for centuries and microwave you a solution that's going to undo it before the end of the third or the fourth quarter. I don't know who that person is, but it ain't me. So I've spent a lot of time this year saying, yeah, I'm not that guy. The fourth thing, no one gets a pass, but it's also not all on organizations either. Organizations are taking a large share of the brunt of this, and we certainly have some culpability, right? As people who work for or with organizations, there is a lot that organizations can do, but just a couple of things that should be pointed out, and we're all aware of this, but sometimes we forget it as we're, assigning blame. The typical person begins their career at about the age of 20, right? And so that means that that person comes into an organization with 20 years of counter programming because they've been listening to grandma, they've been listening to mommy, they've been listening to all their friends, they've been, right? So there's all that programming, and that's not even taking into account things like the media, right? And then they walk into an organization and the typical employee organizational orientation is 3 hours. So you get 3 hours to try and undo 20 years of counter programming. Oh, and that 3 hours, that's not all for this, right? That's not all for racism. In fact, I would say that of that 3 hours, probably about 30 seconds is about racism, because we still have to teach you what it is that you're supposed to do here. We still have to teach you where, the water cooler is, where the file cabinet is, what your retirement benefits are going to look like, who it is that you need to talk to when you have this problem or that problem. So even as we think about this and wrestle with, what is the organization's culpability in this, and what can we do as organizations and organizational practitioners, we have to remain cognizant of the fact that, as Michael pointed out and as Claire reiterated, this is a much larger societal macro level issue that's going to require collaborative partnerships across different systems and levels in order for us to really make something happen. And then the fifth thing is we have no idea where we're going. So when you ask organizations, well, what is it that you're trying to do with, this racism response or with these new, racial equity initiatives, they have no idea, right? Because we're asking them to envision a world that no one has seen. As a history buff, I always try and look for historical precedents so that I can say, oh, well, if I can show you what happened at this point in time. And when organizations are asking me, they're like, well, what does it look like? I literally have to close my eyes and go, okay, well, let me take you to this world that I live in my head, when I'm thinking about what it could look like, because there are no great examples. And so we are literally working without a map. And for a lot of people, that's a reason to punt. But we can't punt. We absolutely cannot punt. We are at this point in time, at this critical juncture, because for so long, people have been punting. And now, if this is going to be more than just that moment where we then move on and, oh, remember 2020, we have to collectively get together and say, we can't keep punting. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. So with that, I'm so excited to see where this conversation is going to go, and let's do it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Avery. Thank you, Claire. Let's start. I want to start with where you ended, Dr. Avery, around how do we help folks envision a world that we've not created? Because that requires a level of courage and radical imagination. And Claire, you started with something called the person. And so I want to use a frame called the person, role, and system to help people start getting some real practical ways that they can move. So let's start with the person. How, for both of you, how does the person need to show up to be able to begin to get on this journey? Not talking about the role yet, but what is just that person work that must happen so that we can ultimately get to a place where when we enter into our role, we can be effective? What advice would you give folks? Claire, let's start with you.
Sure. So therapist by training. So I like to help people think about this like either a faith journey or a therapeutic journey, right? Like a healing journey, right? Like the process you would take and the steps of self-examination and self-evaluation and self-reflection that's required for a faith journey, for a healing, like therapeutic healing journey, is the same process that we need to apply when we're thinking about how have I internalized racism and oppression? How have I internalized notions of superiority and inferiority? And then how has that impacted the way I move through the world, right? Like, so really thinking about who am I? How has my race impacted me, privileged or oppressed, right? How has my place impacted that? And how has that impacted the way that I raise children or interact with, others in community? So that personal work, it's no different than, right, the therapeutic journey or faith journey when you're really taking stock of who am I, how do I show up, and how am I participating or not in this system that we call, America.
Thank you. Dr. Avery.
Wow, that was a great answer.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm going to piggyback on that because I think that it really starts with understanding the lenses that we wear, which is a part of what Claire was talking about, because our identity really colors our perception, right? All of us think that we see the world as it is. But in reality, none of us actually sees the world as it is. We all see the world through the lenses that we have grown up building through the process of our own socialization and through our own, identity politics. And so really the first step is sort of like that scene in the Matrix where you could take the red pill or the blue pill, right? And people have to consciously make that decision that I am going to unplug. Right? So everything that has brought me to this point in my life, I am going to unplug and realize that all of that has a slant. It is all skewed. And I'm going to accept that as the first premise, which then means that I have to be open to all of these things that I have been closed to in the past, right? That there are other ways of viewing these issues. There are other perspectives that are equally valid. And for a lot of people, they either wish that, they had taken the other pill, or they choose to, to remain in the Matrix, right? Because it's a lot easier. It's a lot more comfortable to remain in the Matrix. And so I think that the first thing is to really be realistic about who we are, how we got here, what we see, what we don't see, and recognize that how much of other people's lived experiences are equally valid to our own, even though we can't see them in the same way that other people see them. Just that realization really takes us a long way in terms of recognizing how far we have to go and just why the status quo is so unacceptable.
That's right. I saw something in the chat just now that said, I so wish we could start from scratch. And, you know, there was a wise gentleman, John Gardner, used to talk about self-renewal. And in many ways, that's what we're talking about here, the renewing of the person, the self. A friend of mine says the self is an instrument that should be played beautifully. And that is our job, to renew and try to do that. And so in some ways, I think we can start from scratch, Molly, with ourselves, because that's what I hear my colleagues asking us to do that reboot. And so I want us all to begin to think about, what would it mean for us to renew? To renew in service of creating a better world for everyone. And I'll give you one simple example of how simple it can be, and then we're going to move on to the role. When Michael Brown got killed, I found myself getting really triggered by white men, because I found like when they were speaking, they were denying my pain. And I was hiking with a white gentleman one day, and I was sharing this, like, I'm having a professional problem right now. I can't be shutting down in my job around this issue, and I'm shutting down. And he brought us together. He said, Michael, we did something at Washington University called Black Men, White Men. And he said, we should try to do that in Oakland. And we started talking. We brought a small group of Black and white men together and started talking. And about 6 months in, something really fascinating happened. People started getting comfortable and vulnerable. And one of the white men said, nothing's really particularly happening to me, but I find myself being afraid of Black men. And you think about the power of that statement. First of all, with our masculinity culture, for another man to acknowledge that with a group of other men, that was huge. But then we were able to ask him back. So as a planner in the city of San Francisco, he's no longer there now, what does that mean for you in terms of how you design policy if you walk around with that fear of the other? And we were able to start having these really good conversations. And while there was not a resolution, the art of getting in relationship again with someone that doesn't look like me was the therapy that I needed, Claire. I needed to do my work. And that's just one example of when I said I'm on my own racial journey. Yeah, I was getting triggered by people, but that's not their fault. They were just being who they are. I can choose how to reset and respond to it. So just wanted to share that was one example of possibility about getting in relationship with each other, having these types of conversations and moving forward. And my colleagues will give you other examples as they talk and other resources. But let's move to the role. Let's say the role, people are starting to do some of this therapeutic work, they're renewing. How should they imagine their role when they enter into the workplace?
Yeah, there's so many ways that I can take this, right? And think about like, which direction do I want to go in? You know, because many times we can't separate. We try to pretend as if we can separate ourselves, who we are, from our role and our work, and society in many ways has shaped us to identify with our work, our role and our title specifically, right? But I think we need to think about what is our role. And as a workforce practitioner, if I'm serving as a bridge, if I'm serving as the extended social network, right, of someone who has been historically and systemically left out of a particular system, and my role is to then be a bridge, and I see my role as a servant and a bridge and a connector and a social network, then that should inform the way that I engage with that individual, right? But if we see, which we have done, which is internalized our roles as fixing broken people, then the way that we engage with the individuals that we're serving will be shaped by and influenced by how we see our roles. And so I think one of the most powerful things that we have to recognize is the power that we hold, not only as individuals who are saying, I want to make a commitment to do the work of racial equity and I want to do the right thing. There's power in acknowledging that for ourselves. There's power in acknowledging that for the roles that we play where we really serve as a bridge connecting people who have been intentionally left out to opportunities that they are well prepared and positioned to take advantage of, right? And so really understanding and rethinking what our role is, and how we can then leverage that role to really create and change situations and systems and organisms and cultures for people and on behalf of people who have been intentionally left out. And so an example of that, in my role as a program director, I remember very clearly having a conversation with my white male board chair at the time. And, you know, there was all this conversation about like motivated job seekers, as if like people who are not working don't really want to get to work, right? And so I had to choose in that moment. You know, I was overseeing a program that supported and connected people to job opportunities, and language is a huge role in either oppressing, continuing to oppress, or liberating people. And in that moment, I had to say, I think we need to think about the language that we're using, right? Now, I had the positional power, if you will, as a program director and the person really responsible for making sure things went well, to challenge him in that moment. Recognizing the responsibility in that role, though, was a moment that I needed to say, okay, I have a choice here. I can either advocate for change for the people who I'm serving and trying to connect to opportunity, or I can capitulate because of the power dynamics that are at play in this moment. And so recognizing like where we're situated in our role, but recognizing the power that we have as individual people is also really important to, I think, encouraging us to make the choices towards equity, right? And the decisions to get us towards equity.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Avery.
I 100% agree. I would add, I think that one of the big opportunities that we as individuals have is to claim our individual and collective power. One thing that we oftentimes are too quick to do is we give organizations all of the credit and we depersonalize our own impact on organizations. So when we look at, you know, what's happening in our companies, we say, oh, the company is, as though the company is some unique independent entity that's detached from everyone who makes up the organization. The company is us, right? And so if we want the organization to be different, we have to be different. And one of the things that I have really come to realize is that in organizations that are starting to do the work in ways that we should be attempting to emulate, one of the things that they're doing is they're literally questioning everything, right? So they realize that they can't start over. But one of the ways in which they pick and choose what remains and what, you know, will stay in place is there's this constant reassessment of, why do we do this way, right? Because the default in many organizations is inertia. We've always done it that way, so we're going to keep doing it that way, which is oftentimes ironic when an organization will bring someone in like me who they're going to pay, you know, a large sum of money in order for them to tell me that they don't want to change anything because they've always done it that way. And I'm like, well, what are you doing, right? But the reimagining of, well, why is it that we do it that way? Is there a better way that we could do it, right? And one of the things that I have started speaking about with organizations, particularly with executives recently, is organizations, and in particular, people who are highly successful in organizations, they have a real great understanding of insatiability, right? So they understand that you never get satisfied, you never get complacent, you constantly chase, but it's selective in terms of the way in which they will apply that. And the thing that I'm now pushing them to do is saying, okay, you have a framework that works really, really well. Can we apply that framework over here, right? Because what we see is people say, oh, we, you know, are constantly chasing growth. We're constantly chasing this. You know, we don't want to be satisfied off last year's numbers. And then when I say, well, what about diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's like, oh, we're doing enough of that, right? We're okay where we are. And I'm like, no. If we chase this in the same way that we have been willing to chase some of these other things, then what we will see is this problem that looks so insurmountable all of a sudden becomes much, much, much easier to tackle. in terms of figuring out, well, what do we do next? And how do we do that? How do we get people on board? So I think that part of it is just identifying the ideals and the values that need to be central in everything that we do as an organization, and then ensuring that the reward structures are in place to reward the things that are consistent with those values and to discourage the things that are not. Just one quick story. I was talking to an executive who was asking me if there was any way that he could promote this guy who was a known sexist in the organization without alienating all the women. And my response to him was, well, I sure as hell hope not, right? And that wasn't what he wanted to hear, right? Because what he was doing is he was compartmentalizing and recognizing that this guy was really, really excellent at all of these other things. And I said, yes, but what you're doing if you do that is you're sending a very palpable signal to everybody about the prioritization of your values. And I said, oh, and also, I hope that it's not just women who would get upset by you promoting that guy. Because if so, then you got other big problems within your organization.
Wow, thank you both for this insight. There's a couple things that I'm hearing from you as we think about how do we do our own personal work and then come into our role, bring in our full selves to the work. A couple of things I'm hearing. One is we should have our role undergirded with a set of values that anchor us so that we can keep coming back to those values. What I would also recommend is that you have your work anchored in values and results, because it's hard to know where to go if you've not declared what you want to accomplish. And I find that to be one of the biggest weaknesses in the containers that we set. We're rarely clear about what we want to accomplish in this space. So absolutely have the values, be structured around the results you want to accomplish. And Claire, let's start talking about some questions. My dissertation chair wrote a book called Leading with Questions that is really good. And I watch people do this often. I learned this mastery from women who have been mentors over the years, how to whisper, how to ask the right question and change the whole dynamic of something, right? And so if you want to get some more guidance on how to ask these questions in the right moment, Leading with Questions is one book. But to this notion of voice that you both are talking about in your role, I want you to begin to think about voice not having to be loud. It could be that whisper in the right person's ear that compels them to shift their thinking, like you both have demonstrated in things that you shared here. So you can see how we're bringing in from the person into the role that courage to be anchored with some values, to be clear about what we want to accomplish. You all were able to share those examples because you're clear about what you're trying to accomplish in terms of racial equity and helping people. And you were able to ask questions and provide wise counsel in ways that were authentic. And you were able to let people sit with how they wanted to deal with it. But what they could never say is that you didn't play your role maximally. Now, lastly, this will be our last question, then we're going to open up for conversation with Q&A. When you think about now person role interacting then with the ecosystem, internally and externally, what advice do you have for folks? Because sometimes folks have been, just the person in the role is too much. And now you're asking me to see entire systems. What advice do you have for folks who are like, that's hard for me to hold, that's a lot. Give them some guidance on how to first see the system and what would you want them to do with it?
I think I'm gonna pitch to Derek. I need to sit with that a little bit. That was a good question.
No, it is a very good question. And I think that the thing that I oftentimes encourage my students, whether they're undergraduates, graduate students, or executives, is that a lot of grace is required in this process. And sometimes that grace is the grace that we extend to other people, but equally important is the grace that we extend to ourselves. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why people have such a difficult problem with beginning this journey in earnest is because it requires us to do some real soul searching and to be honest about that person that we see in the mirror. And for a lot of folks, they call a quick timeout right there. And it's like, no, we're going to go right back to what we were doing that got me to this point, because I've been winning this far in my life. There is no need for me to, go down this path, right? Because it's uncomfortable to be realistic about who it is that we see in the mirror. And so that grace for oneself is important, and to realize that you're not going to boil the ocean overnight. Right?
That's right.
You're not going to unplug yourself fully from the machine overnight. This is an iterative process that requires these, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Like each day you just got to do a little bit more. Each day you have to, try and peel back one more layer. And that's where that whole notion of insatiability becomes really, really important, because it's this understanding that we're never going to get there. Right. So the whole problem that I have with the microwave approach is it assumes that, one, there is a finite state towards which we're headed, and two, that we can get there in a short period of time, when neither of those things is true. Right. We're just constantly inching closer and closer toward true equality, toward true inclusion. Claire, did I give you enough time to?
You did. That was helpful. So, if I'm honest, I think what I paused because really, I think in many ways we all know the system is there, right?
Yeah.
We may not have language for it, and we experience it in different ways based on our origin, our background, our race, our ethnicity, et cetera, gender. So we know it's there. Structural racism, and the way that it maintains its hold, is through the invisibility. It's through not naming the thing that we are feeling and experiencing and may not have language for. And so the only way that we undo that is by having a systemic framework and approach, because it is a system that works with all other systems to marginalize and oppress groups of people. The only way to undo that is to have a systemic response that then is constantly working against the way that the system has currently been designed, right? And so practically, this approach, the groundwater approach that you all will be embarking on, is a great way to see the system, right? I think it's a beautiful analogy when you think about fish in the lake and the groundwater, to really start to wrap your mind practically around what a system is and what it feels like. But I would venture to say we all know it's there. We have to decide if we want to go down that road, right? And really call the invisibility out, name it, and then figure out the role that we will play in disrupting it. And that's going to look different for everybody. And I want to name this because I think we don't do this enough. This conversation is a part of the work, right? Yes. Sitting and reflecting is the work of anti-racism, racial equity. It is not only I need to do something, right? I need to have some tangible, we want to see results, but going to therapy and sitting on a couch and talking for an hour will get you to results, right? And it's the same kind of approach. We have to challenge these notions of white supremacy culture and white dominant culture that tells us bigger and progress is bigger and more, and not depth, because we're really talking about depth in this work and understanding it. So I will stop there. And thank you, Derek, for the cover, giving me a minute to pull it together.
Perfect. As before we go to Q&A, I wanted to share, there's a couple of resources that FSG has created that would be really invaluable if you want practical ways to put the person, role, and system together. One, it's called Walmart's leadership helped to create this document. It's called Advancing Frontline Workers. So we'll probably drop that in the chat. The Advancing Frontline Worker document will give you some real tangible tools that you could use. And the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity is another document that will give you some real practical ways on top of other things that we're talking about here. We'll drop those into the chat for you. We were talking to a retailer at PolicyLink a couple of weeks ago. And to the systems question, we said, imagine if your philanthropy was only one part of the liberating work that you did. Imagine in the markets you were in, you could walk in a community and ask one simple question. How are my employees harmed by the communities that they're in? Mm. To your point of the invisible system, can you see the over-policing and the excessive fines and fees? Mm-hmm. Can you see the toxic drinking water? Can you see all the ways in which you're trying to create a really good environment at work for your employees, but the community context is actually causing them great harm? And that was a real eye-opening moment for that firm, because what I was saying to them is their leadership voice would be far more transformative than any of their philanthropy if they could say, we've got 300,000 employees, and in our communities, we expect that you stop hurting them. Imagine the power of that. That would be a systems call to action. It's like, just stop harming. Before we get to doing the proactive stuff, can you just stop the harm, the intentional harm that the Ferguson report showed us after the death of Michael Brown that the Department of Justice did? Imagine if our institutions could stop doing deliberate harm to the workers. And if CEOs and senior leadership could begin to speak out on that the same way they get excited and speak out about a new workforce initiative, et cetera. Because it is those systems things that actually are getting in the way of the workforce initiatives. So if you want a bigger return on investment, seeing the system becomes imperative. So thank you, Claire. Thank you, Dr. Avery, for sharing your advice. You're going to still continue to share more. Let's go to Q&A. And FSG, how do we want to do this? And can you help us with time to know how much time we got left?
Yeah, we have about 25 minutes left. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. So go to participants, look at you, raise your hand, and Antoine will shine a spotlight at you and you'll join the speakers.
All right, let's do it. I hope we didn't run them off.
All right, so we have a hand raised from Emily. Emily, you are on.
Hey, Emily.
When you're on mute, Emily.
Sorry, sharing a question from the chat from Janine LaPrade. She asked earlier, are white men in the corporate sector really ready for this work? What's it going to take to create spaces for white men to be in conversation and community with the most impacted people?
That is not my work. That is not the work that I can do. But I think all of the things that we've said, like, one, we have to know who we can work with and who we can't. White men have to reckon with white men, right? I think men and men, and I think white men and white men. White men who are on an anti-racism journey take their brothers on an anti-racism journey, or hold them accountable to just naming the ways in which that they're operating and upholding the system. But I don't think the process is any different than what we've described, right? Starting with the person and doing that self-reflection. But I do think that having a peer who can influence and who can inspire, encourage, convict, challenge their peers to dig in and do that work is also really important. And so I'm clear that as a female of color and immigrant in this country, that I may not always be the one that can help and work with white men to do their work. I may be able to plant a seed, but they then have to make the choice to decide if they want to move that work forward. But I can identify colleagues, right, who are in this work and say, hey, I want to recommend and connect you to this other white male who I think can really benefit from your wisdom and your guidance and your accountability in that. So that's my 2 cents.
I'll jump in quickly. I love that question. And I love the question because it allows us to talk about something that we really need to talk about, which is that white men get stereotyped too. And one of the biggest stereotypes out there about white men is that they are intentionally perpetuating the, the white supremacist agenda. And that is not universally true. It's not even close to universally true. I know some white men who are amazing champions of diversity. And so I think that we need to be really, really careful about the brush that we use to paint people, because just as those of us who are not white men don't like to be boxed in on the basis of our demographic identities, neither do white men. And I agree with Claire that there are times when their voices are incredibly, incredibly impactful in the room, because just like other groups, we tend to listen with a little bit more earnest and sincerity when the person who's talking has things in common with us, right? Particularly things that we hold dear. And so it is really important that our broad-based coalitions that are pushing for greater equity of all sorts, not just race, but race especially, include folks who are in the power group as well as folks who are in the oppressed groups.
Yeah, and the only thing I will add to this is an important question. And I agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I'll add is that the thing that we are dealing with in this nation that will take white men and white women to help us transition from is the construct of whiteness. The nation was designed to center whiteness, culturally, beliefs, values, systems. And that is that fundamental operating system that makes everything else less than. And if white America does not deal with this construct of whiteness, we have a problem, because you don't want to hear me say anything about it. And the biggest problem that we have right now is it's not like oppressed people aren't saying they're in pain and they're hurt. We can't get the folks who are in power to listen, whether you're black, white, or whatever. And this is the structural problem in the nation. We can't hear each other. We can't see the pain. I can't tell you how many communities we go in, I'm sure you all see this as well, where community folks have been saying there's a problem forever. But if one of us comes into a community with our fancy data sets or whatever, all of a sudden everybody acts like this is some brand new information. It's a revelation. And right before the pandemic, I was in Pittsburgh and community members came up crying. I'm like, why are you crying? And they were crying because they was like, this is the first time folks have heard us. Because the data was simply parroting back what they had been trying to say, but people hadn't listened. They didn't listen because the construct of whiteness says you ain't irrelevant unless I say it's so. And so I really want you to think about the power position that you have, even though you may not feel it. And Dr. Avery is right. We all got to be on our journey, because even this notion of power is foreign to me. I don't feel like I'm powerful, but in my role, people perceive it to have some power in the organization. And I got to pay attention to that, because it sets things in motion that I may have never intended. And so we all have our work to do. But if this racial equity movement is going to take the leaps forward that it has, we need to continue to see white America come to it like the beautiful bouquet we've seen in the street, that multiracial coalition that we've seen. And if you think about it, it's not about a personal attack on white people. It is about getting white people to join us in dismantling whiteness so that we can actually create a multiracial democracy and institutions that can serve that.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Chanel. So Chanel, I'm going to go ahead and add you to the spotlight. You can ask your question.
Hey, Chanel.
All right, thank you. I do apologize. I'm grabbing lunch right now, so I'm in the car.
All right.
Joining us from Greensboro, North Carolina, and I work with economic development program at NC State around rural economic development, but that's neither here nor there. I consider myself to be a community engagement professional in food systems as well as rural development. And one of the biggest injustices that I feel like I face as a young Black professional is that oftentimes I'm asked to do my role as well as solve the racial equity issues of the organization. And so I feel like that's an issue that many other professionals face, doing any type of disparity work. And so I'm wondering, like, what are some best practices for speaking with, your leadership about, feeling like that's not necessarily your responsibility alone, and figuring out the best ways to, promote equity within the organization, but also, making sure that I'm also developing professionally and not being stagnated with having two jobs to do.
I think, and this happens a lot, businesses, corporations, institutions expect, particularly for people of color, that people of color will carry the extra burden of speaking on behalf of or leading the equity work internally. And I think it's okay to name that lived experience is not analysis, and lived experience does not mean that you've been trained to support an organization to address the white dominant cultural norms. And I think it's okay to say, I am interested in supporting this work, but I am not the person. I think the organization should consider hiring someone who is trained and skilled to support our organization. If there is a racial equity committee or a task force, if that's something you're willing to engage in, then that, you can offer that as an alternative. But I think we have to really, and depending on your position, right, you have to be really careful in how you navigate that with the powers that be within your organization, but being honest about your ability and recognizing that organizations have to invest in this work. If they are serious about it, they have to invest, and they have to hire someone, either full-time staff or consultant, to support the work and the journey long-term, and that burden should not be put on staff. And even as we think about, for those of us that interact with organizations, even if there is a staff that is carrying this work, particularly staff of color, how is the organization offering additional compensation for that staff to do this work? Because this is not only academic, intellectual, this is personal, emotional work. There's a burden that is taking place, right? So I'll pause there and see what my colleagues want to offer.
I agree with that. I'm also a big believer in drawing parallels to help people really understand instances where they are making something distinct in a way that it really shouldn't be, right? And in this case, what we're really talking about is we're talking about additional work, and additional work that's being assigned on the basis of your identity, right? In any other context, we would call that discrimination. Right. And so, I mean, again, I agree with Claire about, having to finesse it, right? And not just necessarily coming out and saying, hey, you're discriminating against me and every other Black person that you expect to be involved in, helping us to disentangle the systemic racism within this organization. But I do think that there are ways that we can be eloquent in helping people to, and, going back to the point that, that Dr. Michael made just a second ago, and moving forward, please call me Derek. It drives me crazy, when people, use the titles all the time. But I think that the whispering, right, and the questioning can be a really, really valuable technique there, right? Because if you help people to arrive at the conclusion that you've already made, right, where they come to this conclusion on their own of realizing that what they're asking you to do is patently unfair, then you haven't been the bad guy or the bad person for calling them out about that. But now they've had this own epiphany where they go, oh my gosh, that is, wow, we're not going to do that anymore. So the key is figuring out, like, how do I get you there on your own, where it's not me taking your hand and leading you publicly, where I'm embarrassing you in the process, but I'm allowing you to draw your own conclusion about just how wrong what it is that you're expecting me to do for free actually is.
Yeah. Nice. That's right. Other questions?
So at this time, I'm going to add Faye. I'm going to pass the mic to Faye so she can surface some questions from the Google Doc.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. And just want to say just personal gratitude to the three of you for bringing your wisdom and insight to this conversation. I'm loving this conversation, and so is everybody in the Google Doc. I have to say everyone wants to listen to the transcript so that they can absorb the conversation and internalize it. We have a lot of questions in the Google Doc, and Michael, I loved your framing of self, role, and system. And so actually through the course of the conversation, many of these questions have been addressed. But I did want to lift up one of the questions, and Michael, you started us with the design challenge that we all face. And you also mentioned that the voices of community are not being heard. One of the questions that is here is, how do we, as actors in the system, elevate the voices and the power of frontline workers so that they are part of this redesign? So would love to hear from you all on that question.
Well, you know, I believe that I can't do my work well if I don't hold the interest of entire populations. And that's why you see me starting with that 100 million. That is my population at PolicyLink. And I'm trying to answer one question: are they actually better off? When you think about frontline workers, there's 24 million, approximately 9 million of them are people of color. So you already have an entire population right there. And when you hold the interest of entire populations, it forces you out of being just an ideologue. It forces you to innovate. It forces you, because you can't solve the problem from your own position. I can't solve the problem of the 100 million just at PolicyLink. I've got to join with others. And so for me, one of the best things that I've learned in my career is to center a population. Because when I center it, I'm going to become obsessed with listening to it, trying to understand it, trying to figure out what they need, and trying to figure out how to craft solutions. And I'll give you the perfect example. PolicyLink has still been on the upswing since I took over 2 years ago. But we centered the 100 million population right as me and Angela were going through our transition. And what we discovered is, you know, we could continue to do good work, but we're struggling to answer. Of course, we're getting policy wins here and there, but we're not as accountable as we should be. We could just do reports and put out great data and people would love us and we would get our revenue, but we can't answer the question, is anyone better off? Forcing to center that population made us reimagine our entire portfolio, and we're in the middle of that right now. So I'm asking you to think about what would happen if you centered an entire population, whether it's in Tennessee, Kansas City, or whatever, or nationally. I bet you will be forced to innovate and get out of your comfort zone. Claire, I see you looking.
I was just trying to figure out, I know we're short on time. I guess what I would add, you know, the whole Zoom dynamic is very different. What I would add is that the people have voices and their voices have power. The structural racism denies the valuing of their voice and power. And so if we recognize that we want to operate in anti-racism and racial equity, then it means that we are creating spaces intentionally for groups of people who have been historically and continue to be marginalized and silenced to come and enter spaces where they can bring their full authentic selves. And then we value the opinions, right? And we recognize the brilliance and the power and the authority and all the amazing things, going back to Michael's point earlier, just shared humanity, recognizing the humanity in people, I think allows us to then create space for each other. I use a lot of biblical references, right? Like, what does it mean to love your neighbor? And in the context of this work, we are really talking about loving our neighbor, right? And so what does that mean then? If I love my neighbor, how do I center them and make sure that their voice is heard? And I create space and access and time for them to share. And I value what they have to bring and have to say.
I love what both of you said. I'll add just one thing. I think that one of the things that to me tends to be an indicator of really great inclusive work organizations is they change the defaults, right? And the default for us in most organizations is that the default is denial. Somebody tells us something that we don't want to hear and we just deny it, right? And I think that in really great organizations, really inclusive environments, the default is, I accept that as your truth. Now let's talk about what we can do with that, right? And so when the default is that we listen, we actively listen, we hear each other, and that's the starting point, as opposed to, let me tell you all the reasons that you're wrong. It creates a very, very different paradigm in terms of how we're going to include and how everyone's voice can be represented structurally.
Trey, you have other questions for her?
I think at this point, we're going to go to Emily, who has a question from the chat.
Cool.
So Emily, I'll spotlight you.
Sure. Going back to the topic of grace from the earlier panel discussion, Jen Vanek, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, from EdTech Center World Education said, can you say more about the idea of grace? Hard to balance the need for grace with the reality that white fragility can derail progress in difficult conversations. How do you see this tension or not?
Yeah, I do think there is an inherent tension there. But I don't think that grace is the same as being satisfied. I don't think that grace is an excuse for, one being complacent. I think that grace is an acceptance that, to bring back, Dr. Michael's point earlier, that we're on this journey, right? And that my journey is a lifelong journey and that I'm not going to get there tomorrow. So grace is recognizing that on some days I'm going to sprint and on some days I'm going to walk. Grace is recognizing that on some days I'm going to fall down, right? And so the accomplishment for that day might just be picking myself up, right? It might just be dusting myself off. It doesn't mean that I've stopped my journey. It doesn't mean that I've stopped evolving or I've stopped learning or I've stopped going through the process, but it's a realization that this is not a short-term solution. And so, one can be somewhat forgiving with oneself if we recognize this from the big picture and pan back and take that 30,000 foot view to realize that we're not going to get there as quickly as we'd like. But that doesn't mean that, we're not still on the way, that we're not still on our journey.
Claire said something that triggered for me of memories when she talked about biblical references. I come from a family where I got probably 15, 20 uncles that are ministers. And I used to see this as a sign of weakness. My mother, when she worked as a nurse, would come home when I was much younger and I would hear all these stories of how she was mistreated. And when my mom was hurt, she would begin to hum hymnals. And I would look at her, and I was little and I'd be like, why don't you just fight back? Why are you just doing that? And I thought it was so weak at the time, but the older I got, I saw that that was the manifestation of grace. I saw her use it to hold her family together as my father was an alcoholic. I saw her use it as she maintained her dignity with work and come out on top all the time. And I use it in my own work right now because my intention, my natural predisposition is to want to fight and stop that hurt. But my fight is not with white people. And I need that grace and that understanding in order to stay in this work and not implode, and to be able to be effective and to do what you both have said, which is to still see each other's humanity, because I am not perfect. In the hymnal tradition, there's a song that says, please be patient with me. God is not through with me yet. Many of you all know that if you come out of that Baptist tradition. And I have to hold that on days when I struggle. And so thank you for the reference, Claire, because grace is for all of us. Because if all we're going to do is war with each other, we are not in a results-based conversation that's going to help the nation. We're just warring. And you see us doing that as a nation right now, warring while more and more people are sinking into that 100 million bucket.
Michael, we just have about 3 minutes, so probably just enough time, not enough for the PhDs in the room to wrap up quickly.
I'm gonna let you all have the floor.
So one of the reasons I named the business that I run is named after my mother and my grandmother, Sandra Grace. Sandra's name means brave defender of man, and Grace is unmerited favor. And so, how do we think about, and so I try to embody both of those definitions in this work. We just finished talking about grace, right? Being a brave defender of man. What does it mean to defend a man who has been intentionally, and I'm using man broadly, right? But what does it mean to defend humanity when humanity, particularly humanity that has been intentionally oppressed? And what does it mean to extend unmerited favor to the people who have done that oppressing, knowing that they are also on a journey. And so I encourage all of you to really think about what it means for you to not only do this work, but to live it, to become it. Because that is what is required for the long haul. That is what is required for the work of anti-racism, the work of racial equity. You are not changed fundamentally. And if your circle, if your organizations are not fundamentally changed, yet you are saying that you are doing this work, I challenge you to really consider what work you're really doing, because you should be fundamentally transformed in the way that you think and operate and engage with each other, and in the way that you do business within the roles and respective roles that you have. So I leave you with that today.
Okay, I'm gonna try to do this in 60 seconds. Three things I wanted to wrap up on. The first is your organizations have to stop running from the truth. If you can't admit that you've been complicit and remain complicit in the problem, then you can't solve it. The second thing is that you have to be intentional in everything that you do. Systemic racism is very intentional, and it's not going to be undone without being intentional and being strategic. The third thing is that for all of us, whether personal or professional or organizational, snowballing should be the strategy, right? Let's start with little victories, and you will be amazed at how much you accomplish just by having those little victories become bigger victories.
Yeah. The only thing that I will add is that, you know, get comfortable finding your respite in the struggle. That's where your peace is going to be found, in the struggle. And the last thing is to be clear about the fact that, you know, people like to quote Dr. King by saying the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's not true if we don't do the work. And that's what you hear us calling you all to. And so many of you all have created great examples for the nation on this call. And we just ask that you continue to do that, because that is the work. This is slow and steady work. And if we wanted to accelerate it, we've got to be more courageous to get to that snowball that Derek is talking about. So just think about our peace is found in this struggle for a world that's just and fair for everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael, Claire, and Derek. How fortunate we are to have you. And I definitely want to watch it over and over again. I know someone said that they'll be looking for the transcript. I will be doing the same thing. Really what stands out to me is thinking about this is a design. This is not a bug. This is the feature of our economy. And how do you then design for a new economy? Courage. Gosh, I just feel like that just really came out. Have the courage to face kind of yourself. I heard Derek say that. And then also then to face others, to push them in their thinking. Derek, I just loved all of your references, the slow cooking of the racism, and you can't just microwave it out. So how do you really think about that? And Claire, also thinking about the personal and emotional work that we really need to put into this. If you think about this as a spiritual journey or a therapeutic journey, whatever it is, it starts with the I. And as a systems change nerd, like, you have to know that systems change happens first by looking inside and then moving outside. So thank you so much. We're so fortunate to have you. So you're welcome to drop off. I think I'm taking you away from another meeting that you have maybe, but we are going to, please, the rest of you stay on. We're going to break out into tables. So the same way you would do with the Ron convening, they're already preset. So we will do that in a moment. Please take a look at what table number you're in. We want you to share your reflections on that Google Doc again, so that we can benefit from our collective wisdom once again. And the questions that you need to reflect on are on the Google Doc, also page 8 of your workbook. So pay attention to the table name, and we're going to break out into breakout rooms right now. All right, I hope everyone had a good time in their tables. We're doing on the spot problem solving, so I hope everyone was able to have a good conversation and share some of their thoughts on the Google Doc. For tomorrow, we'll meet at the same time that you met today, in the same way that you got onto the platform today, but just click on the next agenda card for December 9th. Tomorrow is all about frontline employees, centering the work, really thinking about what Michael said, centering the work around people that we're working for. And I'm really excited. We have a spoken word artist to kick us off tomorrow, and he's so good. I've listened to his piece 5 times. It is, I would set it up as the same way that Michael did. We'll push your thinking and hopefully also help you think about courage in the space as well. My colleague Yuli will share in a little bit a quick survey, just 3 questions that you can fill out. It's just a pulse survey. What did you like? What did you learn? And what do you wish might have changed? We'll try as humanly possible to shift things in the next 22 hours. But please, again, give us grace if that's our the word of the week. Give us a little bit of grace on our side as we work through tech and all of these other things as well. So you're welcome to drop off at any point. Now we're officially done with day 1. Thank you so much for joining. We'll have tables again tomorrow. And I'll share a little bit more about that groundwater session and that framing that Claire had mentioned tomorrow. So thank you all for joining. The FSG team and I believe some of the Walmart folks will stay on the line. So if you have any questions, please stay on. I'm happy to answer it. And I love having conversations. So I'm happy to connect with you in any way.